Well, hi there, everybody. It's Mason Miller, and I'm here with Mindy Bonine. We are two archaeologists with Amatera Environmental, and we've been working really hard at the headwaters at the Comal Archaeological Site, and we wanted to come get back to you with another one of these socially distanced excavation analysis updates. It is late summer 2020. It's toward the middle of September. And the last time we got together, which was amazingly back in March.
Yep.
Right when all of this COVID stuff was just starting. So it has been an interesting time for everybody. We hope you all who are watching are staying safe and are doing the best to keep safe and your family healthy and everything like that. You know, with all this stuff going on, we've been hard at work doing a lot of analysis, and we thought it would be good to get together with you guys and just kind of go over some of the things that we've been learning and some of the investigations we've done, and also some new questions that this brings up. So Mindy and I are here to just kind of go over some of those things.
Yep.
So I guess what we wanted to do was just kind of talk about a couple of things. Mostly we wanted to focus on the site itself. So I'm going to bring up the site on Google Earth, the general location of the site on Google Earth right here. So Mindy, can you tell us a little bit about the site and the excavations that were done, and sort of an overview?
Sure. Just kind of a refresher for everyone. It's been a while since we've been out. Actually, it's been over a year since we finished excavations out there, and so you know, that's a long time to remember. So the Headwaters Site is kind of, you know, where that little pin is. That's the entrance. And then Mason, if you want to zoom in for a second, we sort of had three big excavation blocks. The first was block A, which is kind of in that little grassy area where the trees are, next to the big building. Block C is kind of between that long building and the little walking path.
Is that it right there? Can you almost see the?
I think you can see it. Some of these, if anyone's interested in looking through some old aerial photographs on Google Earth, you will see us. Those excavation blocks are there.
Yeah, let's see about there you go.
There you go.
So this is from November of 2018.
November 2018, which is kind of right where, it kind of in the middle of when our excavation was. So if you scroll back on the timeline, so that's block A, and where the cursor is, and then block C is where all those little berms are. And those were trying to keep the rain off when it was raining really heavy. And then block D is a little bit further down and right next to that road. And that block D, if you recall, is right in between the road and the fence for the well yard. So we just kind of plopped a block that was 2 meters wide by 8 meters long in that little section right there. And then we were going to excavate a block B, and that was the one that was kind of right next to those trees. Yeah, right where that.
It's right here, right?
Right there. It's right there. And basically, it just turned into a giant monster. We took the asphalt off and we dug all the fill dirt out, and we were ready to put some excavation blocks in. But then it just rained and rained and rained and rained, and the thing became a pool. And so we were just, it took forever for it to dry out, and we just couldn't get to excavating in that block. So what we ended up doing instead was we got a giant backhoe out, track hoe actually, and with a large boom, and we just excavated one super, super deep trench in that location to see if we can find the bottom of the alluvial deposits to see how deep things could go. So we kind of did that and then mapped it and kind of explored that little area in that method. It's opposed to doing hand excavations. So, and that's it. So that's all of our blocks. So as a refresher.
Yeah, and we're going to kind of keep this open during our discussion here. So this is the most recent from, I guess, November of last year. And it's all cleaned out there.
Yep. Filled everything in.
So I'll go back to just us talking. So when we did all these investigations and they did all the excavations, there was one of the interesting phenomena that we've found, or that Mindy has kind of identified, is that we've determined through a bunch of different analyses, mostly like radiocarbon analysis, and to date all the different types of artifacts, that the site looks to have been occupied as far back as about 8,000 years ago, where we have conclusive dates.
Right.
But that the most intensive time when people were living there the most, at least in the areas that we excavated, those areas were from about 4,000 years ago to about the last 1,000 years ago, so 1,200 years ago, which is which we archaeologists call that's the
late archaic.
Late archaic.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that we noticed, and one of the things that we're going to be talking about mostly today in this update, is actually talking about features. And features are, in archaeology terms, features are essentially like an accumulation of archaeological stuff in one place that they kind of collectively serve a single purpose, a function. And so those are features. And so an example of a feature that you might see in your own world might be like, I don't know, I guess like a house foundation would be sort of a feature.
Or a barn, or, I mean, features can be historic era features and prehistoric features. If, say, for example, if you had a fire pit in your backyard, that would be considered to be a feature.
And in like using that fire pit as an example, inside for archaeologists, that fire pit might have a whole different, a bunch of different stuff in it. So it might have, using a modern fire pit as the example, it would have maybe some charcoal, and it might have maybe some random pieces of aluminum foil that were used to make s'mores or something, or it might have some sticks, or all different varieties of stuff inside this one place, but collectively it was all being used as a fire pit. So that's kind of that feature.
Yeah, it's kind of by purpose, like it was used for a reason. And the features, the types of features that we mostly run into for prehistoric sites, because it contains the most amount of material that can survive the ages, that don't decay over time, would be these burned rock features or cooking features that we run into, especially in Central Texas. So we're going to be talking about a couple of examples of features that we found at the Headwaters Site, about these features. And all the features that we're going to talk about are used for cooking. They are the grill, the oven, main purpose of all of these burn rock features is some kind of cooking event. There might be a couple of ancillary, purposes of some of these burn rock features that, we're trying to explore a little bit. But the main thing is that they were used to cook food. And one of the questions that we have that we sort of explore often is how the food was cooked and what they were cooking. And so those are the main questions that we try to ask about what, when we're exploring these features, is what they were cooking and how it was done. And what that might mean for how people live their day-to-day lives, because cooking is one of those things that you just have to do every day. It's an everyday event.
Yeah, preparing food is certainly, and I think that's going to be something so these features, food is obviously integral to human life, and so features that surround the process of preparing food are also going to be fairly significant.
Right.
I think that so what we're going to talk about is that we saw a trend in the patterning and in the distribution and the size of the types of features, where essentially they're kind of lumped into two groups. We found a lot of smaller features in some areas, and I'll go ahead and bring up the Google Earth again just to show you what the areas we're talking about. So we found a good number of smaller features in Block C.
And by small, we're talking about features that are kind of like a meter by meter, more or less, or less. And that would be like a 3 foot by 3 foot. So if you kind of draw a little 3 foot by 3 foot square on the ground, the burned rock features that we're talking about in Block C kind of fit within that space. So that's kind of how what size we're talking about when we say small. So.
Right. And then the other ones are the larger features. So we found kind of and a lot of the larger features were found in Block A over here, and then in Block D over.
Right. And then so, those kind of came in two types. There were sort of features that looked a lot like the small ones, but just blown up large. It's kind of the difference between a personal pan pizza size and, the extra large for the family. It's the same kind of thing, but it's just much, much larger. So it's bigger than a meter. Sometimes it's closer to 2. And that would be like a 6 foot by 6 foot square, that those larger ones would fall in. And then in addition to that, there was a lot of trash around these middens, like trash of the same kind of stuff that was in it. So these burned rocks were in the features themselves, but then there were also like trashy bits that are kind of thrown in all over the place. And we'll show you some pictures of what that stuff looks like. We saw that in Block A and Block D, but we did not see any of it in Block C.
Right. So let's jump right. Let's talk about. Should we talk about the smaller ones or the bigger ones first?
Let's do the big ones first.
The big features first. Okay. So let's talk about the large features that were in Block A. So what I'm going to do is we're going to be talking about kind of this part of the site right here. I have some models that we can show of. Well, here's a picture of an example of one of these large features.
So what you're seeing is Block A, and that little semicircular pile of burned rock that's in that lower left-hand corner. That's feature 50, and that is a earth oven. That is it's a family-sized pizza of a burned rock. That's where they were cooking foods over a low temperatures for a very long period of time. All the other rocks that you see in the rest of the block is all of the trash from other cooking events that they did. And what, they would clean out these ovens, and then they would just toss all those old little pieces of burned rock in a big blanket. People call it different things. It's either like a midden or a discard pile or a trash heap or any, lots of descriptive words about what that is. But really, what it is,
love to come up with
fancy
words for the same thing.
Lots of different words to way to talk about that stuff. But really, it's just trash. But it shows you how many times something like what you see in that lower left corner has happened. you know, you just kind of imagine all those rocks getting tossed out and then having another, you know, bake done in that spot. You can see that they did that activity over and over and over and over again, to be able to create a big giant blanket trash pile like what we found.
So, and I, real quick, as this little thing here, just as a total aside,
Yeah.
that is not actually related to these
To the feature
features
at all. Yeah.
What is that right there?
Okay, so that is what, back in the recent memory, the field that Block A was in had been used for training grounds for line workers, for utility line workers. And what they would do, they had like utility poles set up in rows so the line workers could practice moving up and down the utility pole. And I actually have a photo of that, the utility poles. And then when the headwaters of the Comal became the headwaters, they took all the utility poles out and then they filled in the hole. And so that's that. That is the remains of a utility pole hole that that they use for line work practice. So
that is in archaeological terms, that is overprinting.
Yes,
is what we call it, where one group of people comes along and digs into the remnants of what other people did. Mm-hmm. That's a term called archaeological. It's called imprinting, right? Or overprinting, not imprinting. Yeah. That's different. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Sorry, overprinting. Yes. Okay. Well, let's see about. Let me bring up an example of a 3D model of one of those larger features here, mm-hmm. so you can see what we're talking about a little bit closer. So this is one of the larger features. This is feature
58.
58.
Yes, and that's also in Block A, but it's not in the same. It's a little bit, you know, further away than feature 50, which is the first one that we saw. This one is feature 58. And again, it's the same thing. It is a earth oven that they use to cook food at low temperatures for a very long time. And the temperatures, they, you know, some archaeologists have done experiments, and the temperatures that are being, you know, that the food's being cooked at is like, it's kind of like when you're smoking meats and something like that. It's, you know, you're cooking at low, just like 100 degrees or 120 degrees, pretty low temperatures, but you're doing it for days and days. And so that is exactly what these earth ovens are supposed to accomplish, is that those rocks they get, you know, they get heated up, and they hold the heat for a long time, and the oven gets covered up with either more rocks or earth, and then the food inside that oven just cooks and cooks and cooks. And then when that's done, they pull out the, you know, they pull the top off, and then they pull out the food. And then the rocks that you see are what's left of the oven. So there was more there, but the stuff that circle of rocks that you see is the bottom of the oven. And you can just imagine stuff being stacked up on top of that for the bake.
Let's compare that with with a small feature that would be found over in Block C. Mm-hmm. So here, I'm going to bring this back. And so we're going to move from over here, where there are lots of these really large features, and you saw that photo that showed all of them, or, you know, a big scatter of ththose types of rocks. So we're going to move over here to Block C. Mm-hmm. And what we have over here is an example, and this one's actually online. We'll put the link to access this one. It's on Sketchfab, but this is an example of one of these smaller features that were more common in Block C than they were anywhere else on the site.
So that big debris field that was in Block A that we showed in the photo, We didn't see that at all in Block C. So all the burned rock that we did find was either directly associated with some kind of, hearth cooking oven feature, or and not necessarily part of any kind of big giant trash field.
Give me one moment here. I've got to get it. I've got a little bit of a technical. Hold on one sec.
Technical difficulties, yeah.
Slight technical difficulties here.
Yeah, that's okay.
Let me move this over to here. There we go. Okay, now we're going to get this to work. Here we go. Let's say kids and pets, kids and show business, kids and pets or animals, don't work with them. And now we can add in there 3D models.
3D models. So this is feature 44. It is the very first feature we found when we were excavating at the Headwaters Site. And as you can see, it's another pile of burned rock, and it's in this nice circular pattern. And it has one big fat rock in the middle, and a bunch of other rocks that are around it. The squares that you're looking at is a meter by a meter. So that's a meter that way. Yeah.
So from this nail over to this nail
is 1 meter long, about 3 feet. And so you can kind of see the size of that thing in comparison to the features that were found in Block A, which were 2 to 3 times the size of that little guy right there. So this is the personal pan pizza, as opposed to the big family pie. So what we're trying to explore is there's these clear differences in size, and one of the questions that we're trying to explore is there a reason for, like why there are some that are small and there are others that are large? Were they cooking different things in them? Were one size for a small group and the other size for a big group? Was one size for food that they ate right away, and the big size was for food that they were going to use to store long term, to have when they didn't have ready access to food? There's so many questions that you could pose around just the basic observation that there are some that are big and some that are small. And so we're trying to kind of go through the checklist of questions to sort of see, like, why, if they were used for different size groups of people, if they were trying to feed groups of different sizes, how would we be able to tell the difference between them? Because right now, as you can see, they're just a pile of rocks. So it's kind of going through and trying to look a lot more closely at those piles of rocks to see if we can find out if there are any similarities or differences between those two different piles. And that might give us a clue as to what they were all for.
So, and I guess, can you tell us a little bit about one of those clues that would be that they've done experiments on calories, right?
Yes. So one of the things, this isn't a set of questions that we thought up on our own, as much as we would like to admit that. There have been people that have been studying this for a long time, and decades and decades. And so one of the things that archaeologists use to try to answer some of those questions is called experimental archaeology, which is basically they try to replicate the things that they see in the archaeological record. So if someone digs up a feature just exactly like the types we showed you, they will try some excavation some techniques to see if they can mimic what we see. So try some experiments, do earth ovens, and see if they kind of can sort of replicate what we see at the end. And some experiments that have been done back in the late 1990s and early 2000s about earth ovens and how much food would get cooked in those ovens and how many calories that food would be. And so we could kind of get a guess as to how much food can any one of those earth ovens cook. And that might give us a sense as to kind of like how many people it will feed and what it might be used for. And so I ran the numbers for based on those experiments that were done in the late 1990s, and they were kind of published in all the big archaeological article. And the one that you're looking at right now, feature 58, that feature had 603 pieces of burned rock. So there are 600 burned rocks in there. Total weight.
Yes, they counted.
They count? Yes, we did. And we also weighed them. So we weighed all the burned rock, and the weight of all of that 603 pieces of burned rock is 243.2 kilograms of rock. And so if a kilogram is about 2.2 pounds. So you can kind of, do the math.
Looks like it's 535 pounds.
500 pounds of stuff. Yeah. So that's not small. It's pretty big. And if you, one of the experiments that Phil Deering did in late 1990s is that he created some earth ovens, and he measured the burned rock, the rocks he used. He calculated how much fuel he needed to be able to get those rocks hot. He calculated how much he used Lechingilia and sotol as an example of the types of food that they cooked in there. And so he measured how much food he put in it and how much calories that food produced after it was done cooking. So he had a little equation that you could plug the numbers in. So based off of that, and I'm going to caveat this whole thing by saying, like, way more experiments need to be done for more data points, because we're just operating off of sort of what the 4 or 5 examples that he used. Of course, yes, I have to caveat everything everything we say. But so if he was going to run that same experiment on an oven that's that size, that is the size of feature 58, we would have between 7,000, 7,200 to 5,200. So 5,200 to 7,200 calories worth of food that would come out of one baking event from that oven. And if you wanted to sort of extrapolate and say your average daily calorie count for a prehistoric person is 1,500, which is kind of, I know it's a little less than the recommended government daily value of 2,000 calories per day, but we kind of use 1,500 because sort of people were smaller back then. And that would be, that one cooking event would feed 4 people for a whole day, like all of their calories for a day. And that doesn't even include any of the other stuff that they threw on. So that's kind of, that's like 400 sotol bulbs. So to give you an idea of like how much food that would be.
So that's a lot of.
It's a lot.
That's a lot of work for the amount of calories that come out.
Right. Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah. And to be frank, it was very surprising. I was expecting it to be more than that. And so I don't know what that means. Like if our calculations are wrong, or the data points are wrong, or if we're not including some other sort of factor that might change that overall more or less. But we can say that the amount of food that would come out of an oven that size is a lot more than the amount of food that would come out of an oven that's the size of the smaller one.
Yeah, let me bring that one up real quick.
Okay.
Talk
So
about that.
yeah, if you want to pull that one, I can do the numbers for that one too.
Let's do that. Where did that one go? Hold on. Phone's ringing. And I think it's important we shouldn't lose sight of one other aspect of this, which is that we in this modern world, we tend to view cooking as like, if you're eating it, then chances are good that you've cooked it. There are a lot of historical records that suggest that, especially in this part of the world, now granted, this is from historical periods, so these sites are a lot older than that.
Years older than that. So.
But that cooking was not nearly as commonly done, because it's a lot of work, it's a lot of effort, it takes time, it's a whole lot of stuff going on. And so we have somebody coming in to talk on the phone for a moment. So let me see if I can bring up that other model here. So here is the...
So that's feature 44. That's the smaller one. And if anyone's taking notes, I will give you the information on that one. So the first feature that we looked at had over 600 pieces of burned rock. This one only had 64.
You can almost count them on the model itself.
You can almost count them on the model.
We'll take your word for it.
Yes. And the weight of that burned rock is 23.6 kilograms, as opposed to over 200 kilograms. So it's a lot less. And then if we were going to do the exact same calculation on calories per quantity of burned rock, then this one would produce between 500 and 700 calories of food if we use the same calculation as we did for the other oven. So it's a factor of, well, it's an order of magnitude less. So yeah, the other one was 7,000 and this one's 700.
So it's like 10 times as much, 10 times as many calories.
10 times, yes. So so the big one had, 10 times the amount of calories as the one this size. And that's, that's a pretty significant margin. So we kind of have to sort of, the big question is, we may not be able to judge exactly, how many people this thing fed when it was being used, but the size differences are so great that we might be able to say some interesting things about patterns of behavior, why people made, why small ones versus large ones, and, what conditions might, might be, is it a food source? Is it, the availability of certain foods that determine whether or not they put the time and effort actually, put the effort into making an oven that's that size versus one that's super big. There's, I think there's enough of a difference for us to be able to sort of say that there's some purpose for small versus large. We just have to guess as to what that might be.
So I think one other part of this that, I got a little bit sidetracked there trying to get the other model up. I think, with, in the ancient world, a lot of these historical records suggest that cooking wasn't an everyday thing because of how much effort it took. Right. And that people would often eat raw food, and that was more common to eat a lot of raw food.
Yeah.
That might be meat. It was, it could be plant materials. It's, it's not just, and so you get kind of a, one aspect of this to think about is there's a possibility. I mean, we don't know. We're not time traveling or anything like that to where we can see for sure what's going on. But there's the possibility that these were more ceremonial type of features, that these weren't, I mean, these were more of a special occasion sort of thing. It wasn't like a, Mom, what's for dinner? Here's some tortillas or something like that. This was an event of some kind.
Right, exactly.
So, and I think, one aspect of this that would be good to kind of talk about, Mindy, is how, especially in block, was it A or C, where all of these features were kind of all lumped on top of each other?
It's C. So it's the smaller features. Were what we did find. So we did not find a big trash field like we did in block A, but what we did find was that we had a bunch of these tiny little hearth features that were stacked on top of each other. Like we pull one out and then there would be another one right on top of it, or we would pull one out and there would be one that would be just off to the side. And so they would be like stacked 4 and 5 high over a very small area. And if you sort of think, imagine yourself kind of walking through the Headwaters Site, and you have this giant terrace, and you could set up camp anywhere you wanted to, and you keep going back to the same spot, second or third or fourth or fifth time. There might be a reason why they're going back to the exact same area, not just the exact same area over and over again. And one of my hypotheses, I guess, is that when you would all of these earth ovens are the end game. Like we're seeing it after all the activity happened, and whatever's left over, what they just dropped and left and didn't clean up after themselves, that's what we find. So all these earth ovens and trash bins are, what was left when they picked up and moved on. So kind of keep that in mind when we're talking about this sort of stuff. So if you had a hearth feature or an oven feature, and your community, used it, grabbed all the food out of it, consumed it, or stored it, whatever you guys did with it, and then you said, okay, it's time to move on to the next spot, and you go, you pick up all your stuff and you move on down the road. That hearth feature was still there, like you could still see it on the ground, and trust me, if we could see it on the ground, they could see it on the ground too. So they may have come back to the same spot over and over again because they could see the remnants of the previous person's or the previous group's cooking event. So, and then they just set up exactly in the same spot, 6 months later or 2 years later or, 10 years later. They could find it on the ground, and then they could set up again.
And Mindy, do you have like an illustration that shows how all of these features are kind of sitting on top of each other?
I can show you what that looks like. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. So this is a example. So if you there's several charts. This is a kind of a graphic of block C, and on the right hand side is it when you're looking top down, and then on the left hand side you have it in what we call in profile view. So if you're looking at it from head on, from the side, and you can kind of see that we have all these little circles, all these different colored circles are features, and they're all stacked on top of each other. And if you look down at the bottom of the profile view, you can see that they're all stacked Like they might be a little bit off. They're not exactly on top of one another, but they're pretty close. And there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or 6 deep, stacked up on top of each other in more or less the same area. And so that was kind of my hypothesis, is that like they may have seen evidence of these older ones, and came back and then plopped the new one right on top of the old one. And we dated several of these, and they all fit within a pretty narrow time frame. So they were all put down at, with, I can't remember exactly what, like how different, but we're talking about hundreds of years, not thousands. So in fact, actually probably like 100 or 200 years. They were kind of all stacked up together, within a really, really narrow time frame.
Mindy, I've got the answer for that.
Yeah.
The radiocarbon dates have the range being between 2,130 and 2,460 years. So
Okay.
300 years
300
roughly
years.
separation.
So all and just to kind of give everybody a little piece of perspective, is that when we're talking about sort of prehistoric hunter-gatherers, especially in Texas and Central Texas, we don't usually talk in terms of hundreds of years of anything. We usually talk in terms of thousands of years of something. The behaviors that we look for and the kind of patterns of human life that we explore, the change doesn't happen very quickly. We see the same patterns of behavior over a very long periods of time, thousands of years. So we generally don't get a chance to, focus in and talk about stuff that's hundreds of years in the making, as opposed to thousands of years in the making. So we have a really opportunity here to kind of talk about, to really dial in and talk and sort of say, this is a very specific type of activity that was happening over a very narrow time frame, 300 years or so, which is, really pretty unique. We don't get a chance to sort of explore something that happens in such a narrow time frame. And again, 300 years isn't that long. You can kind of return to the same landform and probably find evidence of the people that were there before you. On the ground.
And you can also view it in that same perspective. We here in the United States, our whole country is about that old.
Yeah, right.
And so it's all a matter of scale and how you view it. But, for archaeologists, something that's, having that much stuff compacted on top of itself, in such a narrow time range, is a good, clear indication of pretty intensive use and occupation over time.
Right, exactly.
And I guess, so, as we're talking about intensive use, one of the other analyses that we did was, I guess, the lithic analysis that was done. And so the lithic analysis that we conducted, I'll be honest. So let me bring up, I'm going to bring up the Google Earth again. So Mindy, that was, and by the way, I have to say, that is a very nice illustration. I like it. I like the colors and everything. And it does a good job of explaining how these features are kind of laid out and relative to one another.
I was going to try to do different hatch marks and things like that on there, but it was too much. So I had to go with colors.
It's a challenge. One of the challenges, in archaeology is explaining sort of these really abstract concepts that are hard to show in 3 dimensions and on a piece of paper that's going to be in a report or something like that. But I will admit that when we started this project, I was expecting that, and in fact, there's some of the early writings about this site that we put together, and some of the earlier illustrations and videos that we talked about this, we were expecting that this would be an occupation site that was that people would have stayed at for a long time. That
Right.
given its sort of ideal setting, that there's a spring that's there on the property with fresh, clean, flowing water, pretty much a perennial spring that was probably flowing all the time, a good water supply all the time, access to lots of different varieties of plants and animals, both on the dry land and up on the escarpment hillside here, and also the water. So you would
waterways,
have water mussels or turtles or fish or
aquatic resources that you don't have everywhere.
And so we kind of expected going into this that this would be an area where there would be a lot of long-term occupations. And what we found through the lithic analysis, at least through studying the stone artifacts and what are typically common stone artifacts for people who stay put in one place for a long time versus people who are on the move, who are moving around a lot, what did we find out?
So we found that if you had a spectrum of, the types of tools people made when they were planning on sticking around for a long time versus the types of tools people made when they're planning on moving around a lot, we call it like mobility, high mobility versus low mobility. We found that the assemblage from the Headwaters Site is definitely trending towards the high mobility end of that spectrum rather than the low mobility end of that spectrum. And that was also a bit of a surprise to us as well, because we, like Mason was saying, is that we were basically thinking that, hey man, this is a great place to set up shop and spend a whole season just hanging out. But that didn't seem to happen according, if you're going by the types of tools that we located. They were definitely trending towards the side that there would be that the people that were at the Headwaters Site kind of stayed for a short time, but then picked up and kept moving on, kept sort of going on to another location. So we kind of a modern rendition would be, or modern sort of parallel would be like a rest stop on a motorway, like as opposed to a town, like where people would live for a long period of time. This seemed to be less like a settlement and more like a rest stop than we had expected it to be. That just is the nature of the business. We just kind of we come in with certain assumptions about how people lived and what we would be able to find, the remains of all the activities that they had there, and then we do our analyses, and it turns out to be not what we were expecting at all. And so this is an example of what that of a trend that we were seeing that we weren't expecting. So yeah, it was kind of like it. That kind of led us to some additional questions as well. But we were thinking more along the lines that this was a rest stop along a sort of a traveling path rather than some sort of centralized settlement that people were sort of using for over long periods of time.
And so what we have here is this is an illustration of the Balcones Escarpment, which is a prominent landform that runs through the kind of the middle of Texas right here. You can kind of see essentially where it runs, and you can kind of see essentially that this escarpment runs right along. Here's Waco up into Dallas. all the way up into Oklahoma, just crosses over the Red River toward the east side of Oklahoma. But the site itself, the Headwaters Site, is in New Braunfels, which is kind of right about here-ish.
Pretty close. So a lot of people use I-35 as the, like, if you were following I-35.
Yeah, and we've got a drawing of that.
Got a drawing of that as well. Between sort of I-35 kind of skirts the edge of the Balcones Escarpment. And you can see from this picture that it separates two ecozones, which are basically two environmental settings that have significantly different plants, animals, landform is different, and they're going to have different resources available in each of those two zones. And the escarpment, especially in this location, is the dividing line between the Blackenland prairies and the coastal plain and the hill country and the Edwards Plateau. And so each of those areas have different resources that people can use, you know, like landforms, plants, animals, watersheds are different, you know, how much sort of fresh water is available and how wide rivers are, whether or not there are hills and valleys or whether or not it's flat. There's all these differences between these two different types of land. And the people who would use resources from both types of land would really like to be in that middle place so they can access each type depending on the time of year it is, or whether or not there was a flash flood last season, or you know, they can sort of move back and forth. And so the escarpment is on the landscape is a really clear dividing line. There's not very many places where you've got this pretty clear dividing line between two different areas. It, you know, it kind of peters out a little bit to the, like right around Waco is where it kind of peters out. And then I think it's the Nueces River where it peters out on the south side. And
so I think one of the aspects of this is, so I'll bring up that one illustration one more time, is like Mindy was saying, that people who live here, and so here's that Headwaters site right in here, and you can see, so people have, they have access to all of the types of terrain and the animals that live in the Edwards Plateau and in the hill country area. And then they also have pretty ready access to Blackland prairie, so they have lots of plants that live in the more wide open spaces and prairies. And then they also have relatively ready access to the South Texas plains as well.
Yep.
And they could, and people back in this time were pretty mobile. A lot of people were. Not everyone. There were lots of. I mean, there are lots of archaeological sites where people tended to just stay put a lot more. But one of the aspects of this that I thought was really interesting that Mindy brought up, or that she kind of identified in all of this, is the site's location on the landscape, which is an interesting idea that is just being explored right now. So what I'm going to do is go back to that Google Earth image.
So one of the things that we sort of, when you're thinking about, you know, we're talking about hunter-gatherer groups, no horses, no cars, no, you're using your feet like all the time. There is no, you know, there are no other methods of transportation. And you are on the move all the time. That is sort of the founding tenet of hunter-gatherer societies, is that they are constantly on the move. And So you've got, on the one hand, you have a group of people that are constantly on the move all the time. And then on the other hand, you have this crazy landform that obstructs your movement. Like the Balcones escarpment is varying little, here and there, but it can be pretty cliff-like, and it's not easy to get from one side to the other side without having to go down a pretty steep cliff. And in fact, actually, if you go to the Headwaters site itself, you will actually see a little piece of the Balcones escarpment, because it's right, that tree line is it. So that's it.
You can see it right here in the 3D imagery on Google Earth. And what you have is this higher terrace over here that drops to this lower terrace below, and the Comal River kind of forms that boundary line.
That little edge right there.
And from the elevation figures, at least using the Google Earth imagery and the data that they have, you have the elevation here is, it says 215 meters on this side, and then over here on this side it's 192, so that's 23 meters difference. So that's about 70 feet ish, so 6 or 7 stories from this side over to this side. And at this location here, it's 210 down to 192, so 20 meters, so 65 feet or so, so 5 stories. It's a pretty good change in elevation. You're not going to just go down this or climb up it. The easier and safer solution would be to find a path that's a little bit less steep,
a little shallower. Across. Right.
And so go ahead, Mindy.
Okay. And then, there is one of those types of spots right next to the Headwaters site, and that is basically right where Lakeview Boulevard is. If you kind of draw the elevation maps, you'll kind of see that there's a little pinched area of land that kind of sort of eases the elevation change from one side to the other side to be a far more gentle slope than you would if you were trying to walk up and down the much steeper elevation right next to the Headwaters site. And so one of our ideas, and then one of sort of landscape archaeology is definitely the tenets of landscape archaeology kind of play into this, which is basically the study of people and how they use the land. That may be one of the reasons why the Headwaters site was so popular, is because it had a gentle area to be able to get down off the Edwards Plateau and the hill country down to the Blackland prairies and the coastal plain. There was an easy route to be able to walk up and down rather than trying to navigate your way through a more steep terrain and much more difficult travel methods. So that's kind of an idea that we're exploring a bit.
And it's also another part of this that's important is that it's also a prominent landmark. So if you're traveling without the aid of really detailed maps, and it's mostly word of mouth in terms of navigation and things like that, this would be a really good landmark, which is essentially, this is the headwaters of the Comal, as the facilities so named. And so this is the Comal River kind of flows this direction, and then it just stops at the spring right here. And so someone who might be walking along, trying to cross this river, they would know to go upstream until they reached the spring, and then they could cross.
Right.
And so this becomes sort of a landmark that can be used for navigation purposes. There's I think it's a really neat idea. And so as a result of that, it's kind of also back to that concept of that this is like a motor lodge or something like that. It's a temporary place that's
Right.
so essentially you would reach your whatever that next landmark destination might be, and you stay there for a little bit and then you move on. And so this would be a perfect spot to know where you're going to stop.
Right.
And so that's kind of what we're sort of seeing in some of the data. Now, the landscape archaeology side of this, this is just a very preliminary hypothesis of something that might be going on. There's also the possibility that this gradual slope could have been a result of them constructing Lakeview Boulevard. And I'm sure to some degree, if you were to stick right to Lakeview Boulevard itself, that is what's going on. Is, you know, the engineers graded this to some degree to build the road. But as we know in archaeology, roads very often are opportunistic.
Yes.
And they also are used for long periods of time. And what I mean by that is it might have started out as a footpath that was then used as a fence line. And then that fence line was used to define property boundaries. And then those property boundaries were eventually purchased to make a road. And so as you go back to the origin of all of that sort of stuff, there is some sort of a human preference in a route like this.
Right.
That's visible in the roadway itself. And so I think there's a lot to that, and there's something to be said for all of that. And so I think that's a really interesting thing to talk about. So I think we probably should go ahead and move on, and let's just talk real briefly about kind of what we have ahead. What do we have going on and with our analyses right now? What sorts of analyses are ongoing?
So we are pretty much finished with the lithic analysis, but we still need to do the faunal, which is bone, analysis of all the bones that we found, and also the mussel shell is still under we're still doing the investigation on those components as well. The analysis of the features is pretty much wrapping up. And we'll be putting that on hold until we get some more results from the faunal analysis. There's also, we're thinking about doing sourcing the obsidian. We found 3 pieces of obsidian at the site, and we were thinking about we're going to try to source that, where that came from.
And obsidian is a type of stone that's a volcanic glass kind of.
Right. And the nice thing about obsidian is that we
like dragon glass, if you like.
It's dragon glass. It is. It's dragon glass.
That's a type of obsidian that's not real. But anyway.
Yes. They only exist in certain locations. Like you can only get it in certain areas. And the closest to us in Central Texas is in Mexico. So each type of obsidian has specific properties to it that you can identify. So you can find out where even the tiniest little piece, you can find out where that comes from, and how far away that traveled from where it came from to where we found it. And that kind of, again, kind of gives us an idea of the level of mobility between the, sort of the groups that we're talking about.
Or trade networks,
yeah,
things like that.
Yeah, exactly. Or a combination thereof, which is probably most likely the case. Combination of trade versus just natural mobility.
No, I was just going to say, and then I guess the other thing is that Mindy has been working really hard on crunching numbers on all this, all these different artifacts, and trying to look at all of the different features that were documented to get an idea of what they tell us. And so she's doing that as well. I guess what other sorts of analyses do we have going?
Some of the other analyses that we are going to be doing is we found lots of little pieces of burned clay that were inside the features, and we're going to try to figure out whether or not they're just natural remnants of, some sort of firing event, like you've got, little clay nodules that are naturally forming in the dirt, and then you apply a bunch of heat to it and it can turn into like a little clay ball or a little nugget of burned clay. Not the heat's not as hot to turn it into a piece of ceramic, but hot enough to make it kind of change color and be a little bit more friable. But it could also be a little piece of daub, which is a type of building material. So we need to do an analysis of the burned clay to see if there are any tiny little pieces of daub mixed in with it. What else? We actually found quite a few historic artifacts as well, and also a few pieces of prehistoric ceramics that date to the late prehistoric period. And so the quantities of those artifacts are like tenths of percentages of the, all the other stuff that we found. Yeah. Like very, very little. But we do, all the artifacts need to be analyzed. So we're going to be doing some analysis of that stuff too, to talk about not just the we spent most of this time just talking about the late prehistoric, but there's occupations both before that and after it, all the way up through the historic period. So we're kind of going to be touching on those periods of occupation as well.
Okay.
And that's not really it.
Yeah. Well, so in short, we've been up to a lot, but there's a lot left to do. So I would say at this point we'll probably go ahead and sign off here. And I think it's good to just remind everybody to keep checking out the site. Come visit the Headwaters. It's even during this coronavirus sheltering, there are still things to do on occasion out there. And we will keep doing these video updates just to have to give everybody out there a chance to kind of see what all we've been up to. Mm-hmm. Be sure to like the video, subscribe. We'll have some links to some of the models that we were talking about. You can view them online through Sketchfab, and you can also look at the site on Google Earth and that sort of a thing.
Right.
And I guess from here, we'll just say thanks a bunch and have a good day.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Bye.